Thank you, everyone, for joining and joining in good time. Today, we'll be looking at heat decarbonization through district heat networks. This is one of the many webinars we've been running on just the journey to decarbonizing our heat. We've looked at hydrogen, we've looked at geothermal opportunities, and today we're talking about district heat network. Thankfully, we've got three industry players with us today who will be highlighting the approaches to that low carbon district energy systems as one of the routes to net zero. We've got First Energy who will take us through a case study as well in terms of the work that they're doing with Rotherham, and Veolia will be talking to us again around the district heating and cooling systems for NHS Trust. And then we've got Charlotte from Emico, who would be talking about heat network zoning as well, which is quite important for us because some trusts you may find yourselves within heat network zones, which means that heat networks becomes the route to decarbonization. So this is, and I know that we've got trust in here, some of who are already started looking at heat networks and some of you who haven't started to consider it. So hopefully there's enough takeaway from today's session, which then crystallizes into the further events at AHEME as well. So without further ado, I would
work so far, and we'll come on, I'm sure, and hear about Veolia's work on hospitals, and certainly the hospital we work with has really pushed forward on their EPC contracts. But to get to that 80%, things are going to have to be expanded and sped up. That's going to feel a little uncomfortable. And if we're looking at expanding and speeding up, then we've got to get into the more challenging areas. And one of those most challenging areas is what we're here to talk about today: decarbonisation of heating, especially within your existing buildings. So in most of your settings, you're going to have three broad routes to decarbonising your assets, your estate. You're going to have the ability to electrify through large heat pumps. You may have the ability to bring in low carbon gas, either biogas in the short term or perhaps hydrogen in the long term. And you've got the option of heat networks. And I'm almost certain that everyone on this call understands what a heat network is. You've probably got a heat network on your estate already if they're large enough campuses. But broadly speaking, they're very large underground pipes, super insulated, where you're generating heat more efficiently in a central place, and you're decarbonising a range of buildings that are connected to it. And previously they've been described as central heating for cities, because whilst you might have a campus scheme, the trend, and we'll hear from Charlotte later, is for these heat networks to be bigger and bigger and decarbonise whole towns and cities across the country. So if we broadly accept that we've got these three routes to decarbonisation, from our perspective, it's which one is going to be most effective for you to be able to meet your targets. And Clive, can you just move forward a slide, please? So from our perspective, we hear a lot of noise about hydrogen, and there are trials going on all over the place, both trials and application through various neighbourhood trials. They're testing business models for hydrogen production. We absolutely need hydrogen in our economy. There are some challenges with it. We still don't quite have a way to produce enough of it. We're still testing whether we can use our existing gas network to ship it to our buildings. And then in our buildings, there are still some challenges around how we're going to burn it and how we're going to deal with air quality implications of that. But as of this time, hydrogen is on the table as an option, but it might be a little later. The here and now deliverable solution is definitely building level heat pumps, and we see those being deployed all over the place. They do really well in certain settings. From our perspective, they are a bit harder to retrofit into existing buildings. There are some challenges around capacity requirements for them. They require space, and typically they generate a lower temperature heat. So if you're bringing it into an existing system, it's not that the heat pumps can't meet your needs. you'll just have to run them harder, and they'll probably be a bit less efficient, and they'll cost a bit more in the long run. But absolutely an alternative to delivering the here and now. Clive, sorry, I know there's sort of slightly backwards. If you go back one slide, back to the heat networks one, thanks. So from our perspective, heat networks answers a range of these solutions. So they're the simplest and lowest cost way to deliver decarbonisation. They are a proven method, a proven technology right the way across the UK. They're actually more efficient than a building level solution, largely because they're able to access sources of heat that you probably wouldn't do on a campus solution, although you might if your campus is big enough. So waste heat, mine water, perhaps energy from waste, those types of sources. So they become more efficient than a building level heat pump. And I think you can dock them into your existing infrastructure with slightly less work actually than a low carbon heat pump solution. And essentially in most circumstances, you're removing the boilers, although I understand in the NHS estate those might be retained for resilience, and you're putting a plate heat exchanger in between a network coming up to the building or the energy centre or the boiler house, and then it will tie into your existing networks. If you can jump on a couple, please, Clive. So I think there's a kind of a range of models where a hospital, depending on how outward looking the hospital and the trust is, as I say, you've probably got a campus networks. Well, some of you have campus networks already. So, under those circumstances, I think there's just an opportunity for you to decarbonise them as soon as you're able. But there's also an opportunity to either look outwards and think about how you can get better value from your estate and help decarbonise beyond your boundaries, or act as a real catalyst for some town and city level heat networks, essentially by acting as a really important anchor demand for one of these networks. And so just sort of bringing this to life a little bit, this is one of the projects that we're developing. This is the Rotherham Hospital, and broadly speaking, it's taking waste heat from a biomass power plant, and it's taking that heat and it's using very large heat pumps on an industrial site to elevate the temperature, and it's piping it through those insulated steel pipes underneath the streets of Rotherham to connect all the way down to the hospital. And on this slide, you might see the H that you'll recognise in the bottom right-hand corner of the map. So it's about a 10-kilometre network. We're investing about 30 million of private investment, and we've also secured government grant to enable this to be cost effective. So not only is it decarbonising the hospital, actually it's also supporting the decarbonisation of the homes and businesses of the communities that you serve in your locales. So actually, as the kind of really important stakeholder within the areas, I think NHS and hospital has got a really important role to play. So in terms of what that means for costs and decarbonisation, well, if we're comparing this project, the supply of heat via a heat network versus an air source heat pump for the site, then we're seeing about 60% cost reductions on the capital side, and we're seeing about 30 to 40% reduction on the revenue side year on year, and that delivers about 75% carbon saving. Now, the challenge that we've got, frankly, is that we're in this slightly sticky period where lots of people want to go low carbon and they want to do it soon, but it still costs more money to produce low carbon heat than it does high carbon heat, and so that's something that we're going to continue to try and work through together with with our partners. One more slide, please. So this is my final slide. I think it's kind of partly what I think you need, but also what we would need when interacting with the NHS. I'm going to be quite frank. I think what you need is probably a settlement that enables you to meet your net zero targets, and I don't know that you've quite got that at the moment. And I think what we need is open engagement So being willing to chat to people that are approaching you about new solutions. We need the sharing of data so that we can go away and spend our money and our time working out whether there's an opportunity for us to help you decarbonize cost effectively. We also need access to site, plant rooms and all the kind of gubbins, so we can send our engineers in and work out the art of the possible. I think there's a big thing on clarity on decision making and process. Especially that is a little unique trust to trust. So being really open with your partners early around what you're going to have to do and when. Some senior sponsorship within the hospital and the trust is vital, and then an engaged client side project team, so that we can keep talking and keep working together to try and deliver a cost effective solution. That was it from my side. Hopefully that sort of teed us up for colleagues at Veolia and Hemico to talk in a bit more detail about the other aspects.
If people can put questions into the chat, then Dave and others will answer them. So feel free to do that, and we'll circulate those afterwards. Sebastian.
Thanks. Hi everyone. So I'm Sebastian Menu. I'm working for the Technical Direction Energy for Veolia in the UK, and supporting both on-site energy solution for NHS Hospital, been involved in PSDS and loads of energy performance contract over the years, and as well supporting the development and operation of existing and new district heating schemes. So I've got the two, the experience, especially from the technical and commercial, technical aspect of both. So yeah, do you want to go to the next slide? Just so agenda, I'll be talking about just a quick slide to put ourselves in the context of what Veolia has experienced, both hospitals and district heating network in the UK. I've tried to summarize the value, the key benefits of district heatings, and that's very much echoing what John was telling us just before. A quick overview of two energy from waste schemes in Sheffield and Southwark, London Borough. A slide on the carbon emissions, comparing counterfactual, what a heat pump does, what some energy, district energy are doing, and maybe Q&A is at the end, Clive, isn't it? No. So we'll keep the question at the end. Yeah, next slide, please. So for those who don't know us, so we design, build, operate, and maintain, and finance sometime a wide range of project, on-site services, and district heating networks. Two large energy from waste district heating network, one in Sheffield and one in London, Southwark, linked to incinerators, energy from waste recovery facilities. Our Leeds energy recovery facility is also feeding a network that is operated by Vital, I believe, feeding 2,000 homes as well. And yeah, so 3 energy recovery facility, 8 ESCO contracts and 10 O&M contracts. So a fairly good presence in the district heating network world. So we can take any question at the end if you have anything you would like to talk about. And we're actually working with One Energy looking at that Rotherham opportunity because we present on site with the client. So very interesting project we're looking at together. Next slide, please. So yeah, summarizing, so that's very much echoing, as I said, what John was saying before. Key benefits, I would say the minimal disruption to the hospital is one benefit. I've said TBC feasibility, of course, because, well, every project is different. So there are benefits and challenges for every solution, but small footprint is a big one. Heat pump or any local low carbon technology, if you have to build it on your site where you have space constraints, a requirement for car parks or new expansion, new wards, etc. Small footprint is a big benefit. No noise, no scope 1 emission, no local emissions is a good one as well. And by no Scope 1 emission, I don't know how much you're familiar with Scope 1, 2, 3, but Scope 1 emission is your own sort of gas CO2 emissions. So nothing is burned, no fuel is burned on site. So you sort of outsourcing the decarbonization of your heat to the network operator, to the heat network in a sense. And quite important as well, no electrical infrastructure upgrades are required, which is one of the key challenges, I guess, and subjects we are facing with the trust when looking at on-site electrification, which is the main decarbonization today. Mutualized investment, so you have access to technologies or heat recovery yields that would not be possible without mutualizing. Energy recovery from waste is a perfect example. Without district heating network, no one could benefit from that heat that's a bit further away from the point of use. And some other technologies requiring large investment would not be possible without being mutualized, like deep geothermal or some like large scale heat pump, etc. District heating is seen by the British government as something, as a really a strategic enabler for low carbon heating, and there will be long-term support for these schemes, making it safe, I guess, area to invest in, because we know it will be supported on the long term. Thanks, Clive. Quick overview, but Sheffield district heating network attached to the ERF. So we're treating about over 200,000, the waste and recycling for 200,000 homes. And as a byproduct from so all the waste that cannot be recycled get burned into the incinerator. And so we produce electricity, exported to the grid, and sometimes sold as a under PPA agreement to local users. And we also have as a byproduct the heat, which becomes more and more one of the main products actually that we sell and deliver to a very wide range of buildings, 140 buildings, homes, but leisure centers, offices, theaters, universities, so a very wide range of users in Sheffield in particular, 45 kilometers of underground pipework. Similar type of scheme in London, attached to Cellship energy recovery from waste, slightly short of 40 gigawatt hour of heat distributed to over 2,000 homes, and a few local private wire connections. So that could be also something to consider for NHS hospital. It's not just the heat, but maybe the electricity, if there is an opportunity nearby. Yeah, I think that's quick focus on carbon content. To put things into context, so gas boilers, energy center, I guess, is the most common base case counterfactual that we're looking at. So we're talking about 220 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour of heat. So if you were to electrify your energy center today with the current carbon factors of the grid, you would divide your impact by a factor of 2 to 3, depending on efficiency, etc. And that impact will reduce as the grid decarbonizes. Obviously, with anything like electrification, if you purchase green electricity, that value could become zero, but it's sort of it's almost an accounting thing. So I prefer to stick to the grid average. And if you happen to purchase green electricity, that value could be reduced in your returns. Heat from waste is about 60 at the moment and is on a path to reduce in the future while we are implementing carbon capture, some high temperature heat pump to increase the efficiency. There are a lot of things that are going on from a technology point of view to reduce further the carbon content of the energy from waste. And yeah, I guess this overview here is true for on-site heat pump, for example, but if a heat pump is used to deliver heat for the district heating network, those values remain in the same order of magnitude, I suppose, if it makes sense. So a few other examples of technologies and where the industry is going. Cooling, you have cooling demands, and some users in cities have, or industrial areas could have large cooling demand, where having combined heating and cooling network is making the whole system more efficient, because they both sort of recover the heat from each other. And you can do that either locally, but even better in a network, because you sort of benefit from a user that requires heat at the same time as the one requiring heating. And that's what's called, I don't know if you've heard the name of 5th generation district heating network. I encourage you to have a quick look on Google. It's it's about using a very low temperature water being used as a sort of an ambient loop, and you have cooling users and heating users all contributing and recovering heat from each other on that network. So that's sort of mid-long term what the industry is looking at. Other technologies to mention: deep geothermal, biomass or biogas heat recovery from industries or wastewater, as John was mentioning before as well, about recovering heat from industrial areas or where it is. Thanks, Clive. Did I have anything else? Oh yeah, and just a brief overview, echoing again what John was saying about what's a typical process of connecting to a district heating network. So I guess the first thing is to, well, understand your demand, ensure that you have and check there is sufficient capacity and spare capacity in the local heat network in the very early engagement with the local district heating network operator. So I guess the first thing is to identify if you have a district heating in your area. And once that's identified, understand the demand, peak demand, annual load, see what's available on the network, understand the financial elements and your targets, begin the discussion, then start to go into a more detailed feasibility study. Check the requirement for temperatures, look at your resilience strategy, what that role, do you keep backup boilers on site? Is the resilience done at the network level? All those questions would be discussed during the feasibility study. And then look at, potential funding routes for the pipe themselves and for the work, the integration work on your sites. So that's it for our part. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. We can hand over to Charlotte.
Great.
Are you good? You are here.
I am here.
We were worried. Carry on.
No apologies. I had to move rooms. The Wi-Fi decided to collapse in our meeting rooms, which is excellent. So I'm presenting from our office. So apologies if there's any background noise, but please shout if you can't hear me. So really great to be here today. My name is Charlotte Owen. I'm the head of policy and local partnerships here at Hemico. We are a heat networks investor, developer and operator, and we're delivering £1 billion of investment into heat networks between now and 2030. If you go on to the next slide, please, Clive. So what am I here to talk to you about today, and what do I want you to come away knowing? So I want you to know that NHS trusts are critical anchor nodes for heat networks, and heat network developers can actually build their business cases around you. So don't worry if there's not currently a heat network in your area. You might actually be the start of it, and we need people like you to connect to our heat networks, otherwise they don't work. I want you to understand some rules of thumb to figure out if you are likely in a heat network zone. I understand that it's quite complicated at the moment to know how to decarbonize your stock and to figure out what is the right solution for you. But I think there are some quite simple rules of thumb that you can use to figure out whether you are going to be in a heat network zone or not. And people like us can help you to do that. And then I want you to understand how to attract private investment and work with the private sector to decarbonize your estate if you want to. Next slide, please. So what role do NHS Trust and healthcare estates actually play in heat networks? I think this is really important to understand. So NHS Trusts are enablers of community decarbonisation through heat networks. So the reason for this is that when we are investing as a heat network investor, what we are looking to do is identify what's called an anchor load. They're essentially very big heat users, so hospitals, universities, schools, colleges, government buildings, big office blocks, new residential developments, big people that can essentially anchor the investment case in the network. We need as many anchor loads as possible in order to make that first investment. So people like you guys with your estate are really, really important anchor loads that support the growth of heat networks. And without those anchor loads, we can't develop networks to grow, to offer something to the rest of the community as well. So I think this is where it becomes really important to know that we can actually design the heat networks around anchor loads like you. So start off by building a campus-based heat network on your estate, or connecting you in immediately to a wider planned heat network, and developing and expanding out from there. Next slide, please, Clive. So how do you actually know if you are in the right place for a heat network? So the 3 key facts to know here. So the Committee on Climate Change has said in its latest progress report to Parliament that we do actually already mostly know where heat networks will be located. And that is places like towns and cities. We think that the vast majority of the UK's towns and cities will have citywide district heat network. And that's because about 20% of the UK's heat will need to be met through heat networks by 2050 for us to meet net zero. That's roughly kind of most of the UK's towns and cities. We also know that heat networks are 40% cheaper than air source heat pumps when they're deployed in the right places being those towns and cities. And we also know that heat networks are low carbon. This is something that the Energy Department is going to be requiring going forward. And so heat networks that are being built now are going in low carbon, and the existing heat networks that are currently operating are on a path to decarbonisation as well. Next slide, please. So how is the policy and legislative landscape changing? So the Energy Department is currently introducing legislation for heat networks, and this is going to do 2 key things. So the first thing is that it's going to introduce consumer protection, which will be comparable to the protections for gas and electricity. Now, for non-domestic connections like you guys, this is slightly different compared to what you get as a domestic customer, but broadly it will achieve parity with what you get for your gas and electricity, meaning that your heat network utility will operate much like your current gas connection or your electricity connection. And it will also introduce heat network zoning. So I'll talk in the next slide a little bit about what that is. But it's important to understand that within heat network zones, certain buildings can actually be mandated to connect to the heat network. How exactly that process will work is still being consulted on and developed. But the idea is that large public sector buildings like yourselves could actually be required to connect to the heat network over a sort of pragmatic time frame. Next slide, please. So what actually is a heat network zone? So in England, a heat network zone is an area where a heat network is the most cost-effective way to decarbonise your heating. And what is going on at the moment is the Energy Department has created a modelling tool which works out where those areas are. And it spits out something a bit like what you've got on the right. So this is a draft zone output that has been shared by Newcastle Council. And you can see just above the kind of central town of a city centre of Newcastle, there are a few smaller blobs, and one of those blobs is actually a hospital. So you can see that what the model is spinning out is that heat networks are likely the right solution for places like hospitals. And I'll say a little bit more in a minute about what it means to be kind of like outside of a city centre. And these zones will be available from about 2025. So it'll be much clearer from then whether you're going to be in a heat network zone, but we can figure out now roughly whether you will be or not. Next slide, please. So how are we identifying heat network zones? So at the moment, the Energy Department is piloting a process to identify zones. So there are about 28 towns, cities and boroughs that are involved in this process at the moment. And it is important to note that you can actually request information from these pilots that are taking place. But the heat networks industry can also tell you when heat networks will be cost effective. So that's a really important part of what we are actually doing at the moment, is figuring out where are heat networks cost effective. I've just got some background noise. If whoever that is wouldn't mind, please muting yourself. So it was worth picking up a conversation with us. Just gonna put this person on mute. Apologies, hopefully that's better. We can actually tell you where heat networks will be the most cost effective solution. So as we are developing heat networks, much like the others on this call, we are often looking at what the alternative cost would be for an air source heat pump, for example, and the heat networks that we develop will be cheaper than air source heat pumps. We're not really interested in developing heat networks in places where it would be cheaper for you to decarbonise in another way. It's generally not going to lead to the best outcomes for anyone. Next slide, please. So what if my hospital is outside of the city centre? So what we are trying to do as heat network developers is to connect up centres of demand. So we like to describe that heat networks grow out in fingers or corridors. So in the centre of your hand, you have your palm, and that's typically sort of a town or city centre, a big centre of demand. And then what we'd look to do is identify major heat users and heat suppliers at the end of the fingers, and we look to connect them into the town or city centre. You know, often you'll have an energy from waste plant or some heavy industry on the outside of the town where we can take heat from. So we connect that up with the city centre and develop and connect people along the way. And then what we look to do is go through a process called densification. So that's where we are sort of infilling between the fingers to do things like residential retrofit. So if you're outside of the city centre, don't worry about it. It's still, you are probably still going to have a heat network be the right solution for you guys. And that's something that we can tell you quite easily. If you could just click next slide, it sort of shows you that process, Clive. Yeah, so that just shows that process of densification. So that's kind of how the expansion works over time in a rudimentary way. Next slide, please. So what role can the private sector play? So what we can do is help you to understand whether you are likely to be in a heat network zone and whether a heat network is the most cost-effective way to decarbonise. In order to do that, all we really need is to know where you are. It's a pretty simple process. We just look you up on a map, and we can give you a really quick, 30 seconds. Do we think a heat network is likely going to be the right solution for you? And then if you want to progress those conversations with us or with anyone else on the call, then we can. We can also apply for funding to make heat network connection even more cost effective for you. So we can support you with things like the social housing, the public sector decarbonisation scheme applications, and also applications to the Green Heat Network Fund. We can provide investment to decarbonise your estate. So we, for example, have £1 billion that we're looking to deploy between now and 2030, and we're looking to invest into hospitals, estates where they want us to. So if that might be you, please pick up the phone. And importantly, we can take the risk off of the hospitals and allow you guys to focus on patients whilst we still provide that really resilient heat supply. I think historically there's been a sort of expectation that hospitals need to manage their own heat networks and they need to develop their own heat networks. But actually now there is this significant private investment coming into the market, and we actually want to connect up your hospitals. Next slide, please. So what's next? So we can give you an indication of whether heat network is going to be the right solution for you. Have a chat with us. And if you are in an advanced zoning pilot area, you might want to consider reaching out to the energy department as well, if you haven't already, or reaching out to your local council and just having a bit of a chat with them about the zoning pilots. But broadly, yeah, what we need to know is where you are. So if you want to have a chat about whether a heat network is likely going to be the right solution for you, send us over your postcodes and we can give you an answer pretty sharpish. I think that's me, isn't it, Clive?
It is. Thank you very much. So the NH Power is a collaboration of trust. So it's all of you and others who want help and want to benefit from working together. But the resource in the NHS is tight, and you've got to think about where you're coming from. So if you've got just a heating scheme, you're not likely to find steam. So you're talking about lower temperatures. So if you've got a site steam conversion, then that needs to go on in parallel with anything you're doing. If you need to procure a DE partner or work alongside one in the council, that all takes time. So we're talking about processes that take years to complete, which we're not unused to in the NHS, but we can't all start too late. If you've got to deal with backlog or installation or funding during the scheme, even that can take 3 to 4 years. So we're here to help you starting now. If you're ready to go and near going and you have the opportunity to go, we'd like to help you get that underway, because between now and 2032, there's only about 88 years. So if you've got a 4-year process, we better start thinking about kicking the thing off, and that's why we're doing this, to try and help you do that. So the NH Power program is giving you support. We're just about through the second arrow now, the talks. There's just a couple left in this thing. We just about got the workshops together at IHEM. I'll tell you about those in a minute. And then we've got the road shows around the country for those who just can't afford to travel to IHEM to fill in the gap. And then we're hoping that we'll be able to continue to support you during the implementation phase. And support might be as simple as getting you a partner you can work with, but you may have to deal with procurement, and that's kind of where you're going to need help from inside the system. And we can help you with finance, because we can use Emeco's finance, which I'm sure is very good value for money, or we can use finance that we share between us and the NHS, and currently the rates for that are exceptionally good. So this process you all will have seen. We've done the first set of talks in August. We've now nearly finished the second wave with just the hydrogen. We called it East Coast hydrogen, but generally it means everything outside the Northwest. And then there is a technology session for those trusts who haven't got a route to net zero on the 4th of October. And then we're knocking on the door of the IHEM workshops on the 10th, which is everything including district heating schemes, where you'll get a chance to meet our speakers and other people working in the marketplace and can help you. And the 11th is Hydrogen Day as well. So on those 2 days, we're covering those things. You get a chance to meet these people, exchange business cards, ask them questions, and get help with your scheme. So that's going on. By the end of IHEM, we're hoping you're pretty clear on which technologies are available to you to use. You've got an understanding of the routes and some of the timescales that are involved to you, so that you can then focus on that part of your net zero plan. Okay, and after that, then we will have the road show in November and December, which is working about your main options, the idea of investment needs, because you may need to make changes on your site, as well as have some investment in whatever is supplying you with the heat. And we're trying to make sure you leave the roadshow with an idea of costs and revenue implications and where you might find funding to do these things. So the idea is, by the end of the roadshow, then you should be in a position to write your plan. We're also developing some tools which we hope to have ready for you for those workshops. Is the map. We haven't particularly shown you the map today, but every one of your sites is on a map, whether it's in a geothermal zone or close to a district heating zone, or close to hydrogen, or not close to anything. And unfortunately, there's quite a lot of you that are that way. And we'll have those to you so you can see where you are on the map, and what we think may not be as fully knowing your site as you do, but what we think is available to you. And we're also hoping to have a project costing model that would allow you to cost, say, for instance, your options are geothermal and hydrogen, allow you to cost both of those in terms of capital cost, revenue cost, where you get the money from to do that. So that's the plan for that. We have the dates for the road shows at the moment. Those are the dates. The idea is Northwest, Northeast, Midlands, Southwest, and Southeast. We may repeat some of those if we have to. We're looking for volunteers to host us. We need a room, we need a screen, we need to be able to talk to people, we need access to some tea and coffee and the like. We'll do all the technologies in the road show together. So we'll go through them all in one session. and we'll make a costing model available to you for your options. Now, while you've been doing this, now hopefully you've been asking questions and they've been answered. Lorna, has that gone on?
There is, I've just put some stuff in the chat box, Clive, and there is a question on heat tariff. Anyone of the panel can take it, the question is really around what is the equivalent heat energy cost per kilowatts for a typical offtake.
Okay, well, we'll ask
Viola or John, any one of you.
Viola can give us a quick answer, and then we'll pass it to John, and he can give a quick answer. Most of them flirted with it in their talks. John, you want to give it a first stab?
Well, I was actually going to give a go on the first half of that question rather than the second half, which is around grants.
Right. Grants and business models.
So there's broadly two grants available relevant to heat networks on a town city centre scheme. The first that you'll be very familiar with is PSTS, which is I think challenging to secure, given the kind of the first one that clicks the button kind of process. But that does fund an awful lot of the internal works. I think the average is about 85%, as well as cost of connection to a heat network. And we work with all of our public sector customers to try and access that. If you can't access it, there are other ways of solving the problem, but I won't go into that here. And then there's also the Green Heat Network Fund, which was referenced on one of my slides. That's a heat network specific fund, and the announcement for the extension of that, both in terms of the timing out to 2027, but also the amount of the fund. So it's been increased by 200 million, was announced earlier this year. So that's now about a £500 million pot of funding through to 2027, and Veolia, Hemico, us, and other developers, I'm sure, would be working out whether we needed some of that grant in order to make a kind of cost-effective proposal to a hospital. I mean, in terms of the kind of equivalent cost range, that feels like I might be in sort of sensitive commercial territory, so I'm not going to answer that. But I am confident that there's a significant saving over the air source heat pump building level counterfactual.
Can we tempt you, Sebastian, into adding to that?
On the heat tariff?
Yes, please.
I would need to go back. I mean, obviously, it's different for every scheme. The reality for the energy from waste is that it is competitive today already against the counterfactual, or otherwise, our customer would not take that heat. So on those schemes, we're already competing against a local gas boiler, but that's specific to the energy from waste, which is very beneficial today. The long-term low carbon that are not relying on energy from waste, but more like a more efficient centralized heat pump compared to a less efficient local heat pump. Well, as John was saying, it's likely to be cheaper than a local air source heat pump, but what tariff it is exactly, don't want to give a number because it's so dependent on the electrical tariff as well. So what I tell you today might be wrong in a month's time because the wholesale market for gas and electricity has changed and that value would have changed. So I think it's very much case by case basis. Sorry for that loose answer.
Yeah, I think the answers are not particularly nebulous. It is, I think what you said is really around the fact that heat network tariffs are typically on a network by network basis, and the heat network tariff that you get offered is really developed around what the counterfactual will be as well. And I know that it's proposed early enough in the process to kind of help with before you kind of start getting into the commercial development of the project as well. So that's probably a takeaway on that. Great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mary.
No
We've also
worries.
got a question up from Stuart Lane. Might be one directed more towards you, Sebastian.
Is it the plastic?
That's the one, yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately I need to take that away. I mean, the plastic proportion in the waste has already reduced a lot, and we are still producing a lot of electricity and heat out of the ERFs. I need to go back to my colleagues from the waste business. I'm more like from the energy side. So all the part on the waste side, I'm a little bit less familiar. So I need to take that away. And I don't know, is there a mean to answer the questions later on, Clive, that we can
Yeah.
share, some material with the participants?
Yes, Sebastian, what we'll do is we'll upload them onto the NH Power website, the Q&A forum, so everyone
Okay.
can see it on there once we're done.
I prefer asking a more competent person rather than giving you half an answer.
Thank you, Sebastian. We have another question through from Callum Donnelly. Is there a maximum return temperature you'd expect in order to connect?
I think
Depends on the
happy to-
network, I guess, but yes, I mean, depends on the technology and the network. On the ERF today, it's pretty, easy enough in the sense that we're dealing with fairly high temperature. The network relying on heat pump or other type of technology will obviously require lower temperatures. So case by case basis, again, it's technology dependent, but the enabling work to do on the hospital side would be equivalent or similar to what you would have to do for a local heat pump. I mean, John, maybe you have something to add for your Rotherham example, but yeah.
Yeah, it's exactly as you just said. There are some costs involved in improvements on the site side, because with large heat pumps we're looking for return temperatures ideally below 60, but the bigger spread between our supply and return temperatures are kind of the better for our heat pump performance, and the way to achieve that is to support customers to understand what improvements they need to make to their building. So there's a whole process we go through to help them do that. But as Sebastian said, those are improvements that typically don't get into fabric efficiency. They're mainly around kind of controls and flows and that kind of stuff. And then the sort of things that you'd need if you were having an air source heat pump or other kind of heat pump locally.
It's controls. It can go all the way to having bigger emitters as well, depending on how much you do on the building fabric, etc. So it can be a small work, it can be a big work. So that's why I was mentioning the feasibility study as early as possible to identify what it means for you, depending on the technology and the specific network requirement, to identify that early on. It can be very easy and cheap. It can be a bit more significant depending on the situation.
Well, we've probably reached the end of time. Is there anything else, Lorna, we need to grab, or are we done?
No, that's about it. But as we said, we'll circulate the Q&A once they're complete onto the website for everyone, if you keep an eye on the website. Thank you.
Okay, and you'll circulate the questions, and Sebastian can add some stuff if he wants to. Okay.
Absolutely, yeah.
I have a confession to make. I started the recording late and I chopped Mary off the front. So I might stick you on from last time, Mary. I'm terribly sorry.
You don't have to. Don't
I
worry
was,
about that.
apologies for chopping you off.
That's fine. Don't worry about that.
Okay,
Great.
guys.
Thank you,
Thank you all for coming. See you at IHEAM, hopefully. And the 10th, unfortunately, is PSDS day. So that's not great. But anyway, good luck if you're putting a PSDS claim in.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
Thanks, everyone.
care.
Nice to meet you.